Well, let's see if we can get started on time here. I apologize, my voice is a little crowded up. I picked up a bug from somebody, but I'm far enough away from you guys that hopefully nobody will catch it unless something really bad happens, but I'm not anticipating that. So my name is Sean Deuby, and thanks for coming here this afternoon. The name of my session is, once I show it to you, is that your password policies are so last century. A review of modern password recommendations. I almost subtitled this channeling Guns N' Roses. I almost titled this Welcome to the Dungeon, because this is the darkest and coldest room I've spoken in many a day. So I'll see what I can do to make this as ease the pain for you. I'm an identity architect with Edgile and work in the space in the Microsoft Cloud and EMS and all the identity things that we all work in. Password policies are some of the oldest security procedures that we have around. I mean, they've been around just since slightly longer than the password. And they seem to be the most resistant to change. And when I talk about password policies, I'm specifically talking about password expiration, complexity and composition requirements, password length, and password lockout. So why are they so resistant to change? As I said, they're very old. They've been around for a long time. There's a lot of FUD around them because any changes that you make to a password policy affects everybody in the organization. So even as you're considering these things, and at the same time you're hearing conflicting ideas on what a password policy should look like. And so as a result, they kind of tend to stay in place. You tend to not do anything about it, or I think it's fair to say we've all developed a gut feel for what is right, and what a password policy should be. Well, you're wrong. As a result of all of the attacks that we've seen in recent years, and as a result of very large cloud providers having access to all sorts of live data for what this environment is like, there have been a number of studies that have come up and recommendations that have been made specifically in the last couple of years that really kind of upend traditional password guidance. In particular, in 2016, NIST came up with its digital authentication guidelines. Same year, last year, Microsoft came out with its password recommendations. This was Microsoft research based on what they were seeing happening live in their consumer identity store and in Azure Active Directory. So, for example, in their consumer identity store, they do see approximately 10 million user ID password attacks every day. So they have lots of data for what they see. And in addition to that, as many companies are doing nowadays, they troll the dark web for credentials. So they have they know what credentials are breached, and so they have some idea of what the credentials actually are and the passwords are. The CTO of the Federal Trade Commission did a blog post last year citing studies from Carleton University and UNC Chapel Hill that reached similar conclusions. So what are these conclusions? The first is, don't expire passwords. Number 2, don't enforce complexity. Number 3, require a minimum of 8 up to at least 64 character passwords, including spaces and Unicode characters, including emoji. Ban common passwords. And don't change passwords after compromise. So out of these conclusions, there is actually an underlying theme that goes through all of these. And the underlying theme is, it's the wetware, it's us. We can't handle, the human brain can't handle the complexity that's necessary to create a strong password, and I don't say a secure password, but a strong password that works in one identity store and then be able to create strong passwords in other identity stores that have no match, no pattern match between them. So because our brains can't keep up with the complexity that's required, we fall into predictable patterns. The more password rules you put in place, the more password predictability goes up, and the more password quality goes down. Almost, and a good maxim from this is almost every rule you put on a password makes the password quality go down. So let's look at these in a little more detail. The first one, don't expire passwords. Kind of as I just alluded to, frequent changes equals simple passwords. And it also equals highly predictable passwords. I think this is, and the research that comes out of here, most of this, I think, will have you nodding your head because you experience it as a user. The more often, if you have to use an identity system that has you change your passwords more often, it's frustrating because you're a security professional and you're like, all right, I'm going to get this great passphrase and it's going to be really good, and then 30 days later it's no good. And it's like, oh, I don't want to do this again from scratch. I'll just put a 1 on the end of it, or I'll make some change. Well, that's a very predictable change. And it turns out that it doesn't actually even increase security. So if you think about a typical password lifetime is between 30 to 90 days. 30 days is the lower limit. Those of us that work with passwords, identity systems with a 30-day password change kind of beat our head against the wall because it's so much effort. But the attack kill chain of a penetration in an organization is far, far faster than that. From infiltration to getting local credentials to internal reconnaissance to getting administrative credentials to getting domain dominance and exfiltrating data takes place in a matter of hours or days, not 30 days, not 90 days. In 30 days or 90 days, the horse has left the barn, the horse has left the city, the horse has walked out of the country. It's been that long. The attacker may still be on premises, but they're just lingering to see what else they can find. So for example, exfiltrating an Active Directory database, ntds.dit. Once it's offline, offline attacks can execute 7 to 10 billion guesses per second against that database. And so all bets are off. And once they have the credentials, the compromised credentials are used immediately. Complexity. How many of us have had to go through the complexity requirements that just simply say, sorry, you didn't make it. Oh, sorry, you didn't make it. There are systems that make it a little closer and give you some guidance and all that, but complexity is a real pain. And it comes back into the same thing. We fall into predictable patterns. So in this NIST document, there's an appendix that's called the Strength of Memorized Secrets. And in the appendix, they say that analysis of breach password databases reveals that the benefit of such rules is not nearly as significant as initially thought, although the impact to usability and memorability is severe. So it doesn't help you very much, but it really, really knocks down what people choose for passwords. And as I alluded to before, it's especially easy. It makes it worse when a database has been taken that has password history in it. So, every Active Directory database I've ever worked with enforces password history. So if you get the database, these cracking algorithms will have the whole pattern of what people are using for passwords. So what they've found is that even if passwords get changed, and depending on what the situation is, they can predict what the next password is going to be because they have the history. In this UNC study, they found that they were able to crack 41% of them because they had almost immediately from having the previous passwords and being able to predict it. This also plays into what happens for forcing password changes. Online attacks, 17% of accounts had the next password guessed in less than 5 guesses, based on the patterns that they established, that we have to deal with. Now, for password length, there's a little bit of a different kinds of advice here, depending on who you're reading. NIST says that the password length has been found to be the primary factor in characterizing password strength. On the other side of the coin, Microsoft says that excessive length requirements, in other words, greater than 10 characters, can result in predictable user behavior. Now, what they're talking about in the predictable user behavior specifically are people that will say, you know, because there's a long password requirement, people will say Fido, 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 you know, because they don't want to deal with creating a longer passphrase. So really, the choice depends on the threat model that you're trying to really defend against. So for an online attack, you just need a strong enough password length policy to trigger a lockout, assuming you have a lockout policy in place, sort of a 3 strikes and you're out, to lock out to prevent brute force attacks. For an offline attack where someone has exfiltrated your identity store, then the longer the password that you have is, the better. But again, it depends on what the users can handle. Banning common passwords. There is wide agreement on this one that identity systems need to have a blacklist to ban the most common passwords. This is really fascinating. So Keeper Security last year did a study of 10 million breached passwords, and there were 25 passwords that constituted 50% of that. 5 million passwords were from 17 different password combinations. And 50%, 5 million were the top 25. And 17% were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of 10 million passwords. These are other representative passwords out there. I want you to notice the really strong one, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 for the extra complexity, or the one that's the top row of the keyboard. Yeah, it's really pretty appalling. Now, some cloud services do check for this. I know for a fact, because I've run into it, that some of the Microsoft online services do check for common passwords, but most of the other cloud services that I've used do not, check for common passwords. Now, you can look at all of these findings from sort of 2 viewpoints. You can look at it from the viewpoint of a web service identity store, you know, like a SaaS application or an identity provider. Or you can look at it from the viewpoint of an on-premises identity store, such as OIM or Active Directory. And so which hat you're wearing depends, you know, makes you think about it slightly differently. So for on-premises, Active Directory, for example, has no out-of-the-box password blacklist. You have to get a third-party password filter to be able to put it in a blacklist. However, something is in the works for out-of-band deployment, and if you attend tomorrow morning's keynote that Alex Simons is doing, hint, hint, you may find something interesting there. Don't change passwords on compromise. This is one of the more controversial ones, and I'm just the bringer here. And you can sort of look at it from 2 viewpoints. You can look at it from the point of view of an identity system compromise. So the thinking is, if you have an identity system compromise and you change the passwords, it will temporarily stop use of that password by the attacker. However, if you look at it from a more holistic point of view, and remember what I said about the attack kill chain, if the identity database has been cracked, and if it contains password history hashes like Active Directory would, the attackers already have the pattern. So when someone changes their password, they'll be able to guess it almost immediately. Or they may have already installed a backdoor into your network. For a simple user ID and password guess situation, like somebody, you know, gets a simple password for a Gmail account, that's much easier. I would say change it. And obviously that's something we've been doing for a long time, but also make sure you change it everywhere, else that you're reusing that account and password. So recommendations. First, recommendations from the experts. And I kind of talked around this a little bit earlier. So for length, use long passwords if you want more resistance to offline attacks. Note that if you use spaces for usability, and so one of the things that's coming out of this is your identity systems have to evolve to accept some of these standards, and it helps that this is specifically a NIST recommendation to allow spaces for usability and have your identity system be smart enough to help the user out so that if they accidentally have 2 spaces in it, it removes it, so it's only 1 space. So what that does is that allows a user to type in a sentence to log in. And as I said, allowing Unicode characters. Now, if anyone knows how to enter an emoji as a password, I would like to see it, because I presently have no idea how to do it, but I like the idea. Complexity. Complexity, no complexity, if you ban common passwords. Rate throttling. So simple password lockout policies are effective against online attacks. Slows the attacker down. And that allows you to, depending on your viewpoint, to not have the same strength of password or the same length of password. Enforce MFA for all administrators. We all pretty much have to raise our hand and say, yes, I will have MFA to get us in this conference. But enforce MFA for all administrators. Because the reality is passwords you can't secure passwords well enough in this modern world. It just can't be done. It's completely ineffective against phishing, key logging, and social engineering attacks. But MFA does work against it. Furthermore, a good stretch goal is to enable MFA for everyone. But to have MFA for everyone, as other people have said this week, you have to be able to apply conditional access and risk-based MFA, so it is a low pain threshold for users. Otherwise, they're just going to rip it out. If you think your password has been stolen, change it, especially if you used it. That's a pretty easy one. My recommendations are that these recommendations that you heard from NIST and from Microsoft and all that is they work best as a set. In other words, don't just turn off password complexity without turning on banning common passwords. Make sure, and in terms of password length, if you can allow it to be easier for the user to enter them in, and then they don't have to expire them so often. There's a really fascinating website done by Microsoft Research called TelepathWords. And what TelepathWords does is it allows you to start typing in a password, and it will real time try to predict the next characters that you're going to type in and give you a check mark or an X to see if it predicted what it is. So by the time you're done, by the time you've entered the full password, you have a good sense of how easy that password was to predict. It's a lot of fun to go and try it out against it. I think written down passwords are not out of the question if the use case warrants it. If it's your Aunt Sally and she doesn't travel a whole lot of places, it's a lot safer for her to have her passwords on a clipboard at her house or a home office or something like that than to keep them someplace digitally to get them lost. My last recommendation is to use a dedicated password manager. I happen to use LastPass, and I swear by it. It gives you a strong master password. Use its MFA capabilities, so you've got MFA against the password vault that's protecting your passwords. It has a security checking function to show how well you're doing. It has, I recommend that once you're comfortable with it, you bow down to our robotic masters and let it generate a secure password for a website, a big, long, gnarly password that you can never remember, and let LastPass or OnePass or KeyPass remember it for you. And you can take those generated passwords and put it through the Microsoft tool, and you'll see it does very, very well. They are not perfect, but they're a lot better than storing them in an Excel spreadsheet or using these patterns that our brain just can't seem to get past. So to summarize, no matter what you do, passwords alone are not enough. And I think we've been hearing that theme here this week. We need more attributes in the authentication flow that give us better levels of identity proofing. The MFA is the one that we're most comfortable with now, but we're hearing more and more types of adaptive authentication coming down the line. But a user ID and password alone is not enough. The rules are complementary, like I said. Don't remove complexity without putting in password policies. If you remove a length restriction, make sure you have other mitigating factors in place. And make the authentication system help the human, not the other way around. And an example of that is the ability to put spaces in a password and let the authentication system worry about the bits and pieces, but make it easier for the human. Somebody mentioned this the other day, and I thought this was really useful to put in here, which is don't confuse making it difficult for users to be secure with being secure. Obviously, we want to be secure, but we want to make it. A good friend of mine, Gil Kirkpatrick, who couldn't make it here this week, he had a brilliant phrase for this. He said, look, the only people that care about identity are identity people. To everybody else, identity is a speed bump. So you want to make the speed bump as low as possible so that the users can be there for what they really want, which is to get work done. And I've got, in the deck, I have all of the references with links to all of the research, so you can research yourself to your heart's desire and make your own informed decision about what you want to do. And that's it. 23 minutes and 15 seconds. I got like 2 minutes or so for questions. You're all in stunned silence. Okay. Oh, okay. Whoops. That's the second time that's happened. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So we attempted to actually put into our environment some of the recommendations that you have here, and static and regulators, of course. What are your thoughts on
Good point.
we can catch up with manufacturing?
Right. So his point was, they went out and they said, wow, this is great. We're going to go do this. And then HIPAA and everybody else were like, no, you can't do that. You're right. That is a challenge. The advantage is that it's NIST. So I'm not sure. I don't work with NIST often enough to know what the trickle down is. But and we also know that it's the government, and so it's going to take a while. That's a good question. Who would be a good person to ask that question would be Jeremy Grant, who's wandering around here, ex-NIST. So, yes.
Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
You haven't mentioned biometrics as an alternative for completely removing the need for passwords, like the Touch ID on my iPad right here.
Right. No, it's a good point. His point is, what about biometrics? And I think biometrics falls into that category of we have to have more attributes in the authentication flow that help us determine it, so it becomes an and rather than just an or. So he entered his user ID and password, and he did a biometric scan a few minutes ago. A great example is, and I'm a Microsoft-centric person, so I know the Microsoft data more, is that when someone is logging into Microsoft Consumer Identity or Azure Active Directory, they analyze between 90 and 100 attributes at that login time. And user ID and password are just 2 of them. So yes, so it all becomes part of it. So it becomes cumulative. It's not just this alone. It's not just that alone. It's not just that alone. It's the aggregate of all of it. And I think we're hearing Patrick talk about it, and we're moving towards that area. It's a little scary from the privacy point of view when you can tell, and I've heard where the person that is sitting at the keyboard, by the way they're typing at the keyboard, is a similar pattern to the person that authenticated 5 minutes ago, so we can probably keep them authenticated. The technology is fascinating, but it's kind of brave new world too. So, thank you. Oh, one more question. Wait.
What's your opinion on password strength meter? A lot of companies now switch from policy to just show the strength meter, percent, like 50%, 70% when you type the password.
That's a great question. I don't know what most I don't know. I don't have that part of the survey. I'm just reporting the results that have been coming up, but it's a great question to ask.
And you mentioned about the common passwords.
Yes.
Do you know any open source libraries or anything which can be used to detect the common passwords?
I don't. I would do some research. I'm sure there's stuff out there. I teased you about tomorrow morning's keynote, but I frankly don't know the details of what tomorrow morning's keynote is. I mean, I know what it's about, but I don't know the details of how it's implemented. So there may be some information for you on that related as well.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm sorry, and you've been waiting, so.
No problem, that's fine. So in one of your initial slides, you said complex password equals to higher password predictability. I'm not, okay, should I repeat the question? Okay,
Go ahead.
let me repeat the question. So in one of your initial slides, you claim that, what do you say? Password, let's say, if the password is more complex, it is more predictable. Now, I'm not sure if I understand how that is true, because I have my passwords which are complex, but my passwords are usually geographically. Let's say I change my passwords first week of every month. And let's say because in the month of June, I'm here in Chicago, my password for the next month will probably be Chicago CIS 17, which is circumstantial. And it will be complex, but I do not think people will be able to guess that. So my question basically is, how do you equate complexity equal to password predictability being higher?
Well, I would say first that as a security professional at a security conference, you're probably a little bit of an outlier in how well you handle your password management. What generally is the predictability that it's put in place is research has shown that overwhelmingly users will take a core password and then they'll append stuff to it. And they'll append numerically to it, or maybe they'll get fancy. And by the way, all the attackers in the world know that you're using an @ for an A and a bang for an I. It's already been done. So you can just drop that one right now and make it easier on yourself. So the bottom line is when you have Joe or Jane user out there and they have to change their password, they get the complexity. And we've been through this. And you spend 10 minutes trying to come up with a password that is complex enough that meets those restrictions, you're not going to start from scratch. I sit back there and look into the sky and say, what would be a good, you're kudos to you, but you're not the common use case.
So you basically mean when the password which is complex is based out of a simple common word, that is when things go wrong.
Yes, people have to fall into patterns. And so they do the pattern, they do the core, and then they alter it in a predictable way that they can remember. If the human can remember it, the machine can figure it out.
Password $1, password $2, password $3.
Yeah.
He's actually just shown that a targeted attack against him is actually very predictable. If it's targeted.
No, this is just one of the examples. So my password is usually the highest point of the trip, which probably not every might.
So this is what's fun about this, though, is because there are such cherished or hoary old traditions, and people start looking at you, feel like, oh my God, what am I going to do with this? So anyway, food for thought. Go off, and when you get the information, there's plenty of reading here that's very interesting. The Microsoft, you can find most of those. I mean, you can find the NIST. It's right there just by writing that down. The Microsoft is real easy. Just look for Microsoft password guidance. It's got password guidance for users, password guidance for administrators. Very readable. Thank you. I don't want to run over. I don't know how we're doing for time. So, well, I know we're over. So, thanks again.